One thing the 2025 Orioles have been fantastic at is finding new ways to have embarrassing losses. And they did it once again on Tuesday night.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, July 9th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are going to recap the Orioles' heartbreaking 7-6 loss to the New York Mets in extra innings on Tuesday night. Get you the 5 things you need to know from that one, including the best start of Brandon Young's young career, a big inning for the Orioles, and then an absolute meltdown from Bryan Baker on the back end. Then we'll talk a little bit more about the deadline. Listen, I think we're getting all closer and closer to a full agreement here. The Orioles should probably be some version of sellers here in a couple of weeks. But if you're still somehow holding out hope, we'll talk about what the O's would need to do between now and deadline day to actually consider not selling off a lot of their rentals. And finally, we'll talk about if the O's do sell, which prospects and young players could benefit from more playing time in the final 2 months of the year. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Before we get there, though, just did want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcast listening platforms, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Make sure to follow the show, subscribe, leave a 5-star rating and a review. Really, really helps out the pod. And of course, we are right here on YouTube. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. I want to thank all of you who have subscribed. We officially, earlier this week, crossed 9,000 subscribers here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. That is thanks to all of you. As promised, we will be doing a giveaway here on the YouTube channel to celebrate 9,000 subscribers. The official kind of what's the happening of that giveaway probably be announced on either Friday or next Monday's episode. We'll certainly have a cool piece of Orioles memorabilia that we'll be able to give away here. So stay tuned for that one. And as always, if you want to talk ball, you want to complain about the O's, ask a mailbag question, whatever it may be, you can always email me, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. So let's start with another loss that I don't think will take the number one mantle. There is still 24-2. There is still blowing an 8-0 lead in Tampa, but the Orioles' loss to the Mets on Tuesday is up there for worst loss of the season. And every time you think they can't get worse, they try to. And every time you think they're playing well after sweeping the Braves in Atlanta this weekend, they get the off day Monday. They get a Mets team in here, and they're 6 outs away from victory. They lose in heartbreaking fashion again. Mets 7, Orioles 6 in 10 innings is the final score. Game 1 of a 3-game set between these two teams. Orioles now 40-50 on the year through 90 games. And I'm going to get you the 5 things you need to know from this one. And the first thing you need to know is Brandon Young looked awesome in this game, looking like a completely different pitcher from the one we saw in his first 4 big league starts. Now, he is here right now because Cade Povich and Zach Eflin are both currently on the injured list. Of course, with the O's also missing Tyler Wells and Kyle Bradish and Grayson Rodriguez and Albert Suarez, and the list goes on and on. But they're diving back into that pitching depth, and they had to go back to Young, and it's kind of in there because he's the best option right now to be one of their 5 starters. And in his first 4 big league starts this year, a 7.02 ERA. In 16 2/3 innings, he'd struck out 15 and walked 11 batters. And despite just a 4% minuscule walk rate in AAA, known as a command artist with a big pitch mix, it had been a 14%, almost double the league average walk rate in the majors. Now, the guy we saw on Tuesday, that's the pitcher we've seen in the system. That's the pitcher we've seen in AAA Norfolk before getting his call up. This is the guy that is in there for Brandon Young. Now, it's not the flashiest stuff. He's not going to be the biggest pitching prospect in the world, but this guy is in there. Pounding the zone with well-located 4-seam fastballs allows him to get ahead and then go to the off-speed stuff, which is exactly what he did on Tuesday. Final line for Young. He goes 5 1/3, allowing 2 runs on 5 hits, 6 strikeouts, and the big one is no walks for Young. 1 home run allowed. Now, he only threw 66 pitches in this start, and we'll get to why, but by far the longest and best start of Brandon Young's short big league career so far. That splitter, which is his best pitch, it was dancing on Tuesday night. 6 whiffs on that pitch. It had a 68% in zone rate. Now, that's probably a little too high of a zone rate for your best pitch and your strikeout pitch. You want it to run outside the strike zone a little bit more often, but it shows you, and hopefully more importantly, it shows him, it shows Brandon Young himself how well his stuff can play in the strike zone. When you're getting that much swing and miss on balls in the zone, you don't have to nibble as much. You can attack just like you've done in the minor leagues, and you can do it in the majors because he doesn't have elite stuff, but he has enough stuff to succeed in the zone at this level. And he showed that when it all came together in the 5th inning. He was through 4 scoreless against the Mets. He came out in the 5th, and he threw an immaculate inning. Ended it with painting a fastball in the corner. How about his fastball? Like, he was up to 96 multiple times. His average fastball velocity was up over a mile an hour from earlier this season. Hadn't really seen him hit 96 consistently like that, but he was doing that on Tuesday. 9 pitches, 9 strikes, 3 strikeouts, the immaculate inning. Threw all 5 of his pitches at least once. In those 9 pitches he threw, the big pitch mix guy goes to everything. The only cutter he threw in this game was during his immaculate inning. Just the 118th immaculate inning in big league history, and just the 5th in Orioles history. Jimmy Key, Mike Mussina, BJ Ryan, Kevin Gausman, Brandon Young are the 5 to do it. It's the first Orioles immaculate inning since Kevin Gausman in the 7th inning on April 23rd, 2018 against Cleveland, when he struck out Yonder Alonso, Yan Gomes, and Bradley Zimmer in the 7th in a 2-1 Orioles loss. And listen, like, Young did that in the 5th. He came back out in the 6th. It was still just a 1-0 Orioles lead. He wasn't getting a lot of run support. And the 6th didn't go great. He went home run, double, double, and all of a sudden it was 2-1. Did get a fly out to left field from Lindor, and then he was gone. And you could tell it was going the wrong way. And you could argue, kind of only 2 runs, 66 pitches in the 6th inning. Why you pulling him? It's a game you're really trying to win. And it was the correct move to take him out there. I mean, he was going the wrong direction. He was facing the middle of the order. Juan Soto was coming up. It was not a good spot. But don't let that 6th inning cover up how great this start was from Brandon Young. And finally, he takes a huge step forward at the major league level. Now, the second thing you need to know from this one is actually something I already talked about. The second thing you need to know is that he threw an immaculate inning. Yeah, I just combined number 1 and 2. Well, that allows us to jump to number 3 on my list. The Orioles offense exploded in the 6th inning in this game. Up until the 6th, they had gotten an RBI single from Jackson Holliday in the 3rd inning, who also hit a solo homer later in the 7th. But that was pretty much it. 1-0 game. Now they're trailing 2-1 heading to the bottom of the 6th. And Clay Holmes was pitching fairly well, 5 innings of 1-run ball. But the O's just did not let Holmes breathe in that 6th inning. He hits Jackson Holliday on a back foot 0-2 slider. Then Westberg and Gunnar both single to load the bases with nobody out. And the Orioles finally get a huge swing from Ryan O'Hearn. A go-ahead 2-run double into the right field corner to put the Orioles up 3-2. O'Hearn, who was one of the best hitters in baseball in the first 2 months of the season and was named the All-Star starter at DH in the American League, has kind of quietly been struggling lately. Coming into the game on Tuesday, he was hitting just 200 with a 72 WRC plus since June 1st. And especially struggling with runners in scoring position. That was something he was doing well early in the season. Not really the case lately. 217 average, 27% strikeout rate, and 0 extra base hits with runners in scoring position since June 1st. So to get an extra base hit there in that spot was huge. Something Ryan O'Hearn had not done since his 3-run homer off Andre Palante of the Cardinals back on May 27th. That was the last time he had an extra base hit with runners in scoring position. Really good to see him put together that swing, give the O's the lead. And then Ramon Laureano immediately follows it up, knocks a 2-run single into left center field to make it 5-2. And Laureano's a guy who's kind of been picking up the slack since O'Hearn has struggled. Since June 1st, Laureano has a 138 WRC plus and is hitting 321 with runners in scoring position. So he's done what O'Hearn was doing early. And it did it all with nobody out, knocked Clay Holmes out of the game at that point, got into what had been a bit of a struggling Mets bullpen lately. And it was just a really, really good offensive inning for the Orioles there. And it looked like to be enough. It put them up 5-2. I mentioned the Holiday homer in the 7th. They took a 6-2 lead. But the fourth thing you need to know from this one is that Bryan Baker came in and had a complete meltdown in the eighth. When the Orioles went to the bullpen, Gregory Soto got two huge outs in the sixth to keep it 2-1. Sir Anthony Dominguez was filthy in a scoreless seventh to keep it 5-2. And then they go to Baker. That's kind of been the plan lately for the Orioles. Dominguez and Baker have been pitching really, really well. And Baker just has a full meltdown. Comes in with a 6-2 lead, allows a single to Brandon Nimmo, a 2-run homer to Francisco Lindor to make it 6-4. Then a single by Soto and a 2-run homer by Pete Alonso ties the game at 6 with nobody out. First 4 batters reach, and Baker is out of the game. He had not allowed a home run in his last 11 outings entering Tuesday. And Baker gave up 2 solo home runs in one game back on May 4th against the Royals. That was the only other time in his career that he's allowed multiple home runs in a single outing. And Tuesday night was the first time in Bryan Baker's big league career he had allowed at least 4 earned runs in a single outing. And you got to think, like, even with the struggles Baker had at times in 2023 and 2024 in the big leagues, he had never allowed more than 3 earned runs. And only once before in his career had Baker entered a game and then left without recording at least 1 out. That was June 12th of 2022 against the Kansas City Royals. So, yeah, you can say Bryan Baker struggled in the past, but Baker's been, I mean, at worst, the Orioles' 3rd best reliever this year. I would call him, at this point, their 2nd best reliever behind Sir Anthony Dominguez. I mean, he's been a great, just kind of rejoice to this bullpen, essentially. It was just a bad outing. And it happens from time to time. Relievers are so volatile. I'm not going to get on Bryan Baker. He's had a fantastic season for the Orioles, but just this was a meltdown at a bad time. And when you melt down, you want to do it sometimes with walks and singles, because if you do it when the home run ball is allowed, it allows a team to come back much quicker and allows a 4-run lead in the 8th inning to be erased like that. And the 5th and final thing you need to know from the Orioles' 7-6 loss to the Mets in extra innings on Tuesday is that the 10th inning got kind of wild, but the Orioles came out on the wrong side. The O's, after the Baker debacle, did not score in the 8th, did not score in the 9th, and this game went to extra innings, even after Felix and Andrew Kittredge got it there via the bullpen. It goes to extra innings, and they've already used Soto, Dominguez, Baker, Kittredge, and Bautista. So your next guy up on the list is Yennier Cano to pitch the 10th. And he was having his struggles lately, but he'd had a couple of good outings since returning from AAA. So I think he was the clear next option to pitch the 10th inning. And there felt like a clear move for the Orioles to make at the beginning of the 10th. You've got Francisco Lindor on second base as the zombie runner. You've got nobody out, and you've got one of the best hitters in the world, and maybe of all time, in Juan Soto, a lefty, against the righty Cano, who really struggles against lefties, at the plate. You've got Pete Alonso, a righty, on deck, and I'm not saying Pete Alonso is not a good hitter, because he's a great hitter and also an all-star, but Alonso gives Cano a better right-on-right matchup, and Alonso leads the National League in the amount of double plays he's hit into. Yennier Cano, an extreme ground ball pitcher, gets a lot of double plays. And what are you looking for if you walk Soto and make it first and second, nobody out? You're looking for a double play. Not say it was going to happen, but that's what you should. I cannot believe they did not just immediately intentionally walk Juan Soto and send him to first base. Instead, first pitch changeup from Cano, Soto grounds it back up the middle, RBI single, and 1 pitch into the 10th. It's 7-6 Mets. Now, you never know if the inning would have been different, right? Pete Alonso did single on a grounder into right field, so maybe he would have done that anyway, and it still would have been 7-6, and they would have been in even a worse spot. Cano did a good job, even though he loaded the bases with 1 out, to get a strikeout and a line out, and he wiggled out. I mean, you got to give him credit for getting out of the top of the 10th with the way that inning went, only giving up the 1 run, giving the Orioles a good chance to at least tie the game and extend it in the bottom of the 10th, but I couldn't believe it. And then it was weirder because, sometimes teams don't issue intentional walks at all. Really, if you look at the data, an intentional walk is rarely a good idea. To give a team a free base runner is never a great idea. And so maybe you're thinking, especially under Tony Mansolino, the Orioles are very much like, we're not intentionally walking guys. And that I would get. But then later in the inning, second and third 1 out, they intentionally walked Jeff McNeil to load the bases. And that, again, was a smart move. It gave a righty on righty for Cano versus Torrens, put the double play in order for a double play pitcher. McNeil's been red hot. He's a lefty. That was the right move to do that in that spot. But so would have been the Soto one. Like, it's just weird to me that they did one and not the other and walked the worst hitter between Jeff McNeil and Juan Soto. Maybe because it was earlier in the inning and they didn't want to have it be a big inning, and you're okay if you give up the one in extras with the zombie runner. That's a possible part of the thinking. But either way, the O's got out with the one, and you get that zombie runner at second base. You've got 2, 3, 4, Westberg, Henderson, O'Hearn coming up, and the Mets have blown through their top two relievers, Reed Garrett in the eighth, Edwin Diaz in the ninth. So Huascar Brazoban, who's been good this year, but's been really struggling lately for the Mets. He has good stuff, but has been great in the last couple of outings, pitches the 10th, and you've got at least a good chance, you think, to push this game to the 11th, get a run across. And it goes Westberg strikeout, Gunnar pop out, O'Hearn ground out. The Orioles completely roll over again. They've had some really good extra inning games this year where they've kind of piled on. Saturday in Atlanta, they had a big game in Milwaukee. But in a lot of their extra inning losses this year, that runner goes to second base and they don't even move him to third. Like, it's just a disaster sometimes. And that is what we got in the bottom of the 10th on Tuesday. And the Orioles you're up 6-2 in the eighth when you're playing better baseball after sweeping the Braves, and you find a way to lose that. I can't believe they just continue to find ways to lose these games because, quite frankly, they are a bad baseball team this year. And even though they've played much, much better baseball since the end of May, and they've looked more like a playoff team, a 40-50 record is not something you can overcome. I really don't see any way, and no team's ever done it, being this far back at this point in the season to make the playoffs. I don't see any way. I don't see any way the Orioles are not sellers at the deadline. But if you want to hold on to that hope, that's fine. Let's talk about next. What would the O's have to do? What magic would they have to pull for Mike Elias to say, you know what? Let's at least hold at this deadline. We'll talk about that coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by OpenPhone. If you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money left on the table. Think about the last time you had a service emergency, like a burst pipe. If the first plumber didn't answer, did you wait? No, you called the very next one. That's why having a reliable business line is so important, and that's why you need OpenPhone. OpenPhone is the #1 business phone system that helps you streamline and scale customer communication, all from an app on your phone or computer. Your whole team can share one number and respond to customers like a shared inbox. No more, hey, who's handling this one? OpenPhone is offering Locked On Orioles listeners 20% off your first 6 months at openphone.com/lockedonmlb. That's openphone.com/lockedonmlb. And if you have existing numbers with another service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. OpenPhone, no missed calls, no missed customers. So even after another devastating loss for the Orioles on Tuesday night that puts them at 40-50 through 90 games this season, I know some people, I'll tell you what, it's not me, but I know some people are still holding out hope, and that is fine. I completely respect that. It's not impossible for them to turn this thing around. It's very improbable and unlikely, but it's not impossible. And the question I've been getting a couple of times, mailbag questions, different things, wanted to kind of address it here, is what would the Orioles need to do between now and the trade deadline, which is set for 6 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday, July 31st. So we are now, 22 days away from the deadline, so just over 3 weeks. What would the Orioles have to do in the next 3 weeks to make Mike Elias say, hey, we're in this, we're not going to be sellers? And I don't think there's anything they can do right now besides going 19-0 in their next 19 games, where Elias wouldn't at least try to sell one or two of these rental pieces just to set them up a little bit better for 2026 and beyond. But I guess there's stuff they could do where they do sell only just one or two. Maybe they buy a little bit as well, and they try to keep themselves in this wild card race in the final 2 months. But there would be a lot of work to do. Now I'm going to talk about the live standings here. It's about 11 p.m. Eastern time on Tuesday as I'm reading out these standings. So, American League games like Astros, Guardians, and Rangers, Angels has not finished up yet so far tonight. So those games kind of won't be included when looking at the wild card standings. But right now, we're looking at a 40-50 Orioles team that is 7.5 games back of the final wild card spot. That spot is held by the Seattle Mariners, who are 48-43. In between the Orioles and the Mariners, it's not just 7.5 games, which is a big lead. It's not impossible to make up in a little less than 3 months, but it's a pretty big deficit. But it's one thing if, you're 7.5 games back and you're chasing one team, or there's maybe one team in between you and the final wild card. There are 6 teams between the Orioles and the Mariners right now, who are also fighting for the wild card and are closer to it than the O's are. You have the Red Sox 1 game back, Angels 3.5 back, Royals 4 back, Twins 4 back, Rangers 4 back, and Guardians 6 back. All those teams are ahead of the Orioles and still not even in one of those 3 wild card spots currently held by the Yankees, Rays, and Mariners. So it's not just the 7.5 games you're trying to make up. That math can still work. It's the fact that you have to jump 7 teams. You got to jump the 6 ahead of you, and you got to jump the Mariners or whoever's in that last spot to get into the 3rd wild card spot. That is too many teams to jump over with only 72 games remaining in this season. With the 72 games left, the Orioles would have to go 46 and what am I doing? I think I'm doing some terrible math here. The Orioles would have to go 46 and what is that? 30? I guess that would be. Yeah, I'm doing some bad math here. Either way, the Orioles would need to get 46 wins in the final 72 games. 46 and 26. There we go, Connor. He finally learns how to do some math. 46 and 26 to get to 86 wins. Now, there's no guarantee that the Orioles would get in the playoffs with 86 wins, but that is a .639 winning percentage you got to play at for your final 72 games just to give yourself a shot. Again, 86 most years gives you a good shot, if not gives you that final wildcard spot now that they've expanded to the 3 wildcard teams in each league. That's really good baseball, 46 and 26. And even then, that 46 and 26 has to be at least 8 games better than the Mariners and at least 7 and 6 and 5 games better than all those other teams in front of you. And you get to play some of those teams, so you control a little bit of your destiny, not all of it. But what are the chances at this point that not just the Mariners collapse like that, but also Boston and Anaheim and Kansas City and Minnesota and Texas and Cleveland all play not just worse, but considerably worse than you in the last 72 games to give you a shot? That is where the data is just not on their side. There are too many teams to try and jump over. Now, I know that's not the full question here about the playoffs. It's about what do they need to at least get to by July 31st? The Orioles have 19 games between now and July 31st. I think if you were to go 12 and 7 in those 19 games, right? 12 and 7 is at least that's a pretty respectable stretch at that point. If you win that many games, you're playing at a .632 win percentage. You needed to do a .639 the rest of the year. So I think .632 is pretty on par with what you need to do to somehow find a way to keep yourself in. This is 2 against the Mets, 3 against the Marlins at home, then 3 at the Rays, 4 at the Guardians, 3 versus the Rockies, and 4 at home versus the Blue Jays. That's the 19 games before the deadline. If you are 12 and 7 there, you are still looking at a 52 and 57 record. Now, that's not a good record. It's better than 40 and 50, and it gets you closer, but it's not really as much about the record itself. It's about how close are you to the wild card and how many teams do you still have to jump. So even if they are still 5 games under 500, let's say I'd like them to, at the very worst, be 4 games back. So cut it from 7.5 to 4 games back in the next 19 games. Not impossible of the final wildcard spot. And I'd like for them to at least have jumped 3 of the 6 teams ahead of them. So the 3 closest teams right now are Cleveland, Texas, and Minnesota. I would like for them to have the 3 of those teams behind them. It's okay if maybe still, Boston, Anaheim, Kansas City are still ahead of them, but jump half the teams ahead of you and get to at least 4 games back. I think that's like the minimum to at least maybe consider not fully selling off of those rental pieces. And that's going to be really tough to do if you're only going 12 and 7. You're probably going to have to play better than that, 14, 15 wins to get to that point. And that is where I just come here at 40 and 50, and I'm just like, I think this Orioles team, it's not going to be a rebuild. They're not going to sell off a bunch of controllable pieces, any of their core, but they have a lot of intriguing veteran rentals that teams will want at the deadline that can get the Orioles back something to help be a winning team again next year. And I just think that is the decision that needs to be made at this point. So if that is the decision, the O's are going to trade some vets. They're going to clear up some playing time for some younger guys. Which of those younger guys could benefit? We'll run through that list to finish off the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game more exciting. You're already following the action, why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. It's easy to use, fast to pay out, and makes regular season games feel like must-watch events. You can watch a bet ride into the ninth inning. FanDuel makes it feel like you're part of the action. And if you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Just open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. So I do think, and feel free to hold out hope, it's still not impossible, but I do think the Orioles are going to be some version of sellers at this year's deadline. And they got a lot of intriguing pieces, especially rentals, guys that are generally, that means they're going to be free agents after this year. Their teams are going to want, even if they're just getting 2+ months of them, they're going to want them. And so the question is, okay, who would be traded? But we've kind of gone over that already. More importantly, for the Orioles, who would step in and take that playing time and be able to benefit from it? So the first guy I'll mention that won't be being traded, even though he is a rental performing well, is Gary Sanchez. He had that knee injury on Saturday, went on the IL on Sunday with a PCL sprain. We learned on Tuesday that Gary's timeline is about 8 to 10 weeks. There are about 12 weeks left in the season. 8 to 10 weeks puts Gary down for most of the rest of the year. He's an impending free agent. He's not getting dealt. It would have been hard to deal him anyway because the Orioles have 4 catchers on the injured list right now. Alex Jackson made his Orioles debut in the 10th inning Tuesday, making it 6 catchers who have played for the Orioles this year, tying their franchise record for catchers playing in a season. So we're not going to see Gary Sanchez getting dealt. So first one is Ryan O'Hearn. We're going to dive into his trade possibilities a lot more on tomorrow's episode. But if O'Hearn goes, I would say a lot more playing time for Coby Mayo. You know, he is currently on the roster, but since Tyler O'Neill came back from the injured list, he's playing only every once in a while. He'd be your almost everyday first baseman if O'Hearn gets dealt, especially with Ryan Mountcastle still being out for a good chunk of the second half. Now, he's going to be back at some point, but he'll be out for a good chunk of the second half with that hamstring issue. Coby Mayo is going to get a lot of time at first base. In terms of the roster spot, it could also open up a roster spot to potentially bring Heston Kjerstad back in somewhat of an O'Hearn role. He'd still be fighting for ABs with O'Neill and Ramon Laureano and Coby Mayo, but could at least get him back on the roster. For Cedric Mullins, if he was dealt, get another rental-type player. I think Colton Cowser would almost certainly move into an everyday center field role because it is a possibility that the Orioles go into 2026 with Colton Cowser as their main center fielder. Now, he's played the position a good amount before, but he's never been the everyday guy because he's always been there with Cedric Mullins. I think it'd be a good tryout for him to see, hey, can he really play there every single day? So he'd get a lot of time moving over to center. In the short term, you'd probably get Dylan Carlson back on the roster, back from AAA. He was productive. He can play all 3 outfield positions. But eventually, Mullins being moved definitely does have the opening for Dylan Beavers to get called up and played some. I mean, Beavers entering Tuesday had a 146 WRC plus in AAA, been one of the best hitters in all of AAA baseball this year, one of the Orioles' top hitting prospects. The outfielder Dylan Beavers would certainly open some space for him. If Ramon Laureano were dealt, playing well, has a cheap club option for 2026, he could bring back the Orioles a nice little return if they trade him. It's another possible opening for either a Heston Kjerstad or a Dylan Beavers to be added to the roster. If both Mullins and Laureano get traded, it could be both Beavers and Kjerstad come here. Maybe even a Judd Fabian from AAA Norfolk could get a chance. But if only one of them gets dealt between Mullins and Laureano, I think it would be really interesting to see if the Orioles kind of have like a choice to make. Do we call up Dylan Beavers or do we recall Heston Kjerstad to get some more of these big league at-bats? That would be a really interesting decision for the Orioles to make on August 1st if it did come to that. I'd be intrigued to see if they were put in that position. Charlie Morton, been pitching so well lately, feels like a yes that he's going to get traded. Short term, if this many Orioles are still injured, you'd probably have to add Chase McDermott back to the rotation. Like he's the next guy up in AAA right now. But eventually, as you get healthier, it opens more space for Grayson Rodriguez, Kyle Bradish, Tyler Wells to come back into the rotation. Also, Cade Povich and Zach Eflin, who are on the injured list. But short term, you get a little bit of Chase McDermott, which could be rough. He's having his struggles with command in AAA. Zach Eflin and Tomoyuki Sugano. Eflin's on the injured list for a little while. Sugano's been terrible lately. Both are rentals, but both seem very unlikely to be traded at this point. But they would fall into the same camp as Morton. If they are dealt, you'll get a Cade Povich back at some point. You'll get some of these guys back at some point to kind of backfill those roles. Moving to the bullpen, Seranthony Dominguez and or Andrew Kittredge could be dealt, and especially Seranthony could bring back something nice. The three righties in AAA who could get some time, Colin Selby, Yarmil Geraldo, and Cade Stroud, they've all pitched a little bit, been kind of up and down in the Orioles bullpen this year. They've all been really good at AAA. They all have really good stuff. The Orioles will give more of a full run to one or two of those guys if Dominguez or Kittredge are both or traded. And I could also see both if maybe the Orioles try to trade one of their controllable relievers. Like, it's not out of the question that a Bryan Baker or Yennier Cano could be traded at this deadline as well. That gives more openings to a Selby or a Geraldo or a Stroud. Also an opening for maybe Chase McDermott to work in relief if he's not needed as a starter at that point, because I think we're definitely moving to the DL Hall path for Chase McDermott, whereas like the stuff is awesome, doesn't really know where it's going, can't pitch deep into games. This might be a really good reliever. And the same goes for Wells and Bradish and Rodriguez if they come back and they need the roster spots. Obviously, Dominguez or Kittredge are both not being here. Baker, Cano makes it easier. And then I put Gregory Soto in a different spot just because he's a lefty, and currently with Keegan Aiken on the injured list, Gregory Soto is the only lefty in the Orioles bullpen at this moment. Now, hopefully the shoulder injury that has Aiken on the IL isn't too serious. We haven't really heard many updates about that, but hopefully he's back soon and can kind of just replace Soto when Soto's most likely dealt to be the only lefty in the bullpen. But if not, I think Grant Wolfram, who we've seen up in the big leagues a couple of times with the Orioles this year, would definitely get a fair shot in the pen if Soto is traded. He's got a 2.34 FIP in AAA Norfolk this year. I think he deserves a little bit longer look for the Orioles. And same thing with guys like Selby and Geraldo and Stroud. These are guys who you want to see, hey, do they have a legitimate shot to be a part of our bullpen next year? The end of the year is a good space for that. So the question is kind of what would the roster then look like? This is assuming kind of full-ish health. So we're counting, Aiken and Povich are back, and the guys coming back from elbow surgery. We're assuming Rodriguez and Wells and Bradish are back, but I'm not counting on the likes of Jorge Mateo, Ryan Mountcastle, Gary Sanchez, Albert Suarez, guys who seem like they could miss the whole year. Not super counting on them to be back. So in the infield, you have Rutschman at catcher, Mayo would be your main first baseman, then Jackson at second, Henderson at short, Westberg at third. In your outfield, Tyler O'Neill, Colton Cowser, Heston Kjerstad for a little while there, and then your DH/your bench guys, Dylan Beavers, Dylan Carlson, probably Maverick Handley if he's back, if not Chadwick Trump, if not Jacob Stallings, whoever the backup catcher is, Ramon Arias, and then I think Luis Vasquez continues to get some play on that bench. Your starting pitchers, Trevor Rogers, Zach Eflin, Tomoyuki Sugano, Dean Kramer, and then between Grayson Rodriguez and Kyle Bradish, one of them is healthy enough to start. One of them's kind of a floater in the bullpen. And then in that pen, you got Bautista, Cano. I'm going to say Scott Bloet's DFA'd, Corbin Martin's DFA'd, Bryan Baker is traded also. So maybe Bautista, Cano, Tyler Wells, maybe Cade Povich because he struggles to get deep into games, works out of the bullpen. Then Yarmil Geraldo, Keegan Aiken, Colin Selby is kind of what your bullpen looks like. And then when you get to those September call-ups, maybe you bring back a Brandon Young, and that's where a Samuel Basayo finally gets his shot on this roster. So it's certainly a step down. The Orioles have a lot of talented guys who are rentals who could be traded at this deadline. It will not be the same team after the deadline if they really go full sell. But if you're going full sell with the rentals, it means you really don't think this team is a postseason team in 2025. And from what we're seeing right now from the 40 and 50 Orioles, even as they're playing better and could continue to play better as the season goes on, they've just dug way too big of a hole. The smart thing for now and the future is to at least sell a good chunk of these rentals, get what you can get, try and get some pieces that are closer to the big leagues that can help you next year, and try and regroup and be a winning team again in 2026. But let me know here in the Locked On Orioles YouTube comments, like, who did I leave out that could get some bigger playing time? Disagree on who could jump in when some of these guys are traded. Certainly let me know if I missed anybody who could get a real shot for the final 2 months if the Orioles do sell off a good amount of these pieces. That'll do it for today. So tomorrow, Orioles-Mets game 2 tonight, remember, is on ESPN. This is a national broadcast exclusive game. It's a 7:05 start. Sugano goes for the Orioles. He'll try and turn things around. David Peterson, the 29-year-old lefty, goes for the Mets. He's got a 3.18 ERA coming off one of his better starts of the year, 6 2/3 one-run ball against the Milwaukee Brewers. And then I will be back on Thursday recapping everything you need to know from game 2 between the O's and the Mets. And we're going to do something fun on tomorrow's episode, most likely. have a couple of guests on, one representing the Seattle Mariners, one representing the Cincinnati Reds, two teams that need hitting and two teams that would be very interested in Ryan O'Hearn at the deadline. I'm going to hear from both of those guys who cover those teams super closely, and they're going to propose some Ryan O'Hearn trades, and I'm going to leave it up to you to choose which deal would be the better one for the Orioles if they trade Ryan O'Hearn. That's a fun exercise we're doing coming up on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.